Hello out there in live stream land. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're coming to you live from the University of Memphis, where we're going to be talking about the life, the career, and specifically the pedagogy of one of my musical heroes and someone I've had the great pleasure of calling a musical mentor over the last 11 to 12 years. And of course, I'm referring to Wycliffe Gordon, who you see on the screen behind me here. If you're not familiar with the name Wycliffe Gordon, he's perhaps best well known as a member of the Wynton Marsalis Septet. He was with that group from 1989 up to 1995. And then when Wynton Marsalis disbanded his septet in the mid-90s in favor of beginning what we now know as the Institution of Jazz at Lincoln Center, Wycliffe then became a founding member of the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra. And he was with the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra from 1995 right up to 2000. Now, since that time, he's gone on to create one of the most prolific careers in jazz today. He has recorded a total of 21 solo CDs and another 8 CDs as a co-leader. He has been voted Downbeat Magazine's best trombone on several occasions: 2012, 2013, 2014, 2016, and 2018. He's won the award for the Jazz Journalist Association Trombonist of the Year 12 times between 2001 and 2019. And in addition to all of these performing credits, he's also a very dedicated, inspirational teacher. He's in demand around the world as a clinician. He's held residencies at a number of universities and has held full-time faculty positions at Michigan State University, the Manhattan School of Music, the Juilliard School, and he's currently Director of Jazz Studies at Augusta University in Augusta, Georgia. Augusta University happens to be where I had some of my earliest musical lessons as a high school student, and then after a couple of music degrees, it's also where I had some of my earliest teaching experiences. Now, that opening selection you heard was a transcription of a Wycliffe Gordon recording of the tune Georgia on My Mind. And I first became aware of this particular recording off of an album called Standards Only. Highly recommend checking that out if you're not familiar with it. There's a total of over 20 tracks of Wycliffe playing various standards. That was one of the first Wycliffe Gordon transcriptions I ever learned after receiving some wise advice from another trombonist, one Mr. Delfeo Marsalis, who told me to learn to play like the players you love listening to. And there's no one I really enjoy listening to more than Wycliffe Gordon. And I chose that particular selection for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a good introduction to his musical style. Being a standard gives you an idea of how he plays a standard. But in addition to that, it's also a good introduction to the story of Wycliffe Gordon as well as my personal connection to him, which really owes everything to the fact that we happen to be from the same hometown. I was born in Augusta, Georgia, and I'm not sure if you can see this, but if you can see the map here, Augusta sits right on the border of Georgia and South Carolina on the Savannah River. There's a picture of the Savannah River with downtown Augusta in the background. And I was born and raised in the Augusta area. Wycliffe was born in nearby Waynesboro, Georgia. He moved into Augusta when he was 10 years old. And some of the things Augusta is known for It happens to be the home of the Augusta National Golf Club, where the prestigious Masters Golf Tournament is held every year, virtually every spring, except for, of course, this year. But Augusta National is just a few blocks away from Augusta University. Happens to be the home of the late, great James Brown, one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. You can see I've got my James Brown t-shirt on today. Got this from the James Brown Family Foundation, sent to me directly by James Brown's daughter, Deanna. If you want one of those, check out the James Brown Family Foundation. But major influence on modern music, hard to overstate the impact that he's had. And perhaps quite appropriately, one of the major employers in the area is a place called the Savannah River Site. The Savannah River Site is known to locals as the bomb plant. It's a government facility built as part of the Manhattan Project for the refinement of nuclear materials. And considering the impact that Wycliffe has had on the trombone world, I think that's an appropriate juxtaposition to bring up there. There's a certain energy in that area, much like Memphis, Tennessee. There's an energy to Augusta that's hard to describe. As I said, Wycliffe grew up in Augusta. He was introduced to music first by his father, Lucius Gordon Sr. Lucius was a classical pianist, and Lucius taught piano lessons. He was an active performer in the church, and Wycliffe says he grew up hearing classical music at home. He heard gospel music at church, country music on the radio, and he was later introduced to jazz through a record collection that was left to his family by a great aunt who had passed away. And within that collection was a jazz anthology. And that jazz anthology covered the history of jazz, from early slave chants all the way up to the modern jazz of the time. And he recalls listening to things such as the Count Basie Orchestra, the Duke Ellington Orchestra, some more modern jazz at the time was like things like Sonny Rollins, the tune Sunny Moon from Two, great Jimmy Cleveland trombone solo on that tune. But really what caught his attention was the music of New Orleans, and especially the recordings of Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Sevens group. So much so, he decided to learn some of the solos off of those early New Orleans recordings, and especially the Keyhole Blues was one that he listened to a lot. Learned all of the solos off of that record, the clarinet solo, the trumpet solo, as well as, of course, the trombone solo. And like many of us, Wycliffe began playing trombone in the junior high band. He started playing trombone at 12 years old. One of his early positive influences was his band director, Mr. Harkness Butler, who he credits as being a particularly positive influence. Always giving him the encouraging words of "You can do it, Cliff," anytime he wanted to audition for a region band, all-state band, anything of that nature. And he had a number of positive experiences as a high school student. He attended the Georgia Governor's Governor's Honors Program in 1983. He was selected to be a member of the McDonald's All-American High School Band in 1984. And these positive experiences led him to study music in college. He went to Florida A&M University, and that is where he first came in contact with Wynton Marsalis. And from there, the rest is really history. Wynton Marsalis came down, worked with the band a little bit, took note of Wycliffe, and to make a long story short, a temporary gig turned into a recording engagement, which turned into a full-time gig with the Wynton Marsalis Septet in 1989. Now that brings me up to about the time I first met Wycliffe, which was the late 1990s. I was a student at South Aiken High School in Aiken, South Carolina, and this guy walks into the room. He's carrying a trombone and a leather gig bag, very casually dressed. He had on sweatpants and a gray Go Army t-shirt, if I remember correctly. And my band director introduced him as Wycliffe Gordon, the trombonist with Wynton Marsalis. Now, I'd heard the name Wycliffe Gordon. I wasn't real familiar with him, but I knew who Wynton Marsalis was. I'm pretty sure I'd seen him on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or something to that effect. But I knew who Wycliffe was simply because a buddy of mine back in the trombone section, I played euphonium at the time. You can see my trusty Yamaha 321 euphonium there back in high school. But my buddy back in the trombone section, Douglas Ward, took lessons with Wycliffe. And Douglas loved the trombone more than anybody I've ever met. I have to point this out. He tragically passed away from carbon monoxide poisoning while studying the trombone at Interlochen, of all things. But Douglas took lessons with Wycliffe. He was usually first chair in our band, and as I said, loved the trombone more than anybody I've ever met. Douglas's sister, Joy, who played oboe, took lessons with Wycliffe, and I thought that was a little bit unusual. This guy's teaching trombone and oboe. And I used to go over to Douglas's house. We'd play duets. And when their mother found out that I was interested in playing jazz, she said, oh, maybe you should take some lessons with Wycliffe. And at the time, I thought, well, I've got a pretty good euphonium teacher. I'm first year All-State. Maybe I should just stick with what I've got. And it would actually be another 10 years before I ever got around to taking a formal lesson with Wycliffe. But on this day, I did become a fan of him and of his music. So Wycliffe took the podium. He talked to the class a little bit, and then he said something interesting. He said, I don't know if your teachers want me telling you this, but here's what I do for a warm-up. And I thought, okay, he's going to play some long tones, some lip slurs, maybe some scales. Well, he proceeds to play something along the lines of this. Imagine as a high school student, I'd never heard anybody play the trombone, much less any other brass instrument like this in my life. And then he comes back right behind my seat in the euphonium section, borrows a tuba from one of the tuba students, and proceeds to give us a similar demonstration on the tuba. And by this point, I'm just floored, right? My jaws hit the floor, my eyes are wide open, and I instantly became a fan. I went out and bought a couple albums. I knew he played with Wynton Marsalis, so I bought the Wynton Marsalis Septet live at the Village Vanguard, and great album if you're interested in hearing his work as a sideman. And then as he started releasing solo albums, I started picking those up as well. But you hear a number of things going on there, and I think if we take the two examples you've heard so far, Georgia on My Mind, and that track which is called Warming Up, it's off of an album called Blues, 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 we get a good idea of Wycliffe's musical style. And if we start by just looking and listening to the interpretation of the melody on Georgia on My Mind, we have what I would characterize as really a vocal interpretation of the melody. He's sliding into notes, falling off of notes, much the way a jazz singer would do. And I'll try and demonstrate a few of these things as I talk about them. But he's using a lot of slide inflection. Right, very much a vocal quality to it. His approach to rhythm is very interesting. At times he plays with the time, kind of pushes and pulls against the rhythm section. He uses what I characterize as really a conversational rhythm at certain points, things like right, things that are a little bit unorthodox. You don't hear him playing a lot of just steady eighth notes, steady streams of eighth notes. And he likes to throw in these little rhythmic hiccups. When I was learning that solo to Georgia, one of the things that tripped me up was this line. Right, it's just tricky little rhythms he throws in there right when things are grooving along. Of course, there's the strong influence of the blues. As I said, Warming Up is off of an album entitled Blues, Blues, Blues. And that album can be bought separately. It's also disc 1 of a 4-CD box set called the Wycliffe Gordon Signature Series, which is 4 CDs of original music that is really characteristic of his personal sound, his signature style. And entitled Blues, Blues, Blues on the first album, you can tell there's definitely an influence of the blues in what he does. And then there's certain little musical gestures that I just refer to as Wycliffe-isms, right? Things that are characteristic specifically of him and that because of his playing have really become standard in the bigger jazz lexicon with ideas like this. Right, that's one of those Wycliffe-isms that I hear quite often in his playing. And then with Warming Up, George is a standard, but with Warming Up, that's an original tune. It's more of a free improvisation. And we hear him making use of a number of different things, unique timbres and articulations. He starts off like this. Right, almost like a didgeridoo kind of sound. And by all classical accounts, that's really a bad tone, right? If I had say a 6th grade trombone student come to me playing like that, I'd probably try to get them to open up their sound and open up their oral cavity and round out their tone. But for Wycliffe, it's just another part of his improvisational language. It's just another tool in the bag that he can use. He makes use of interesting articulations. Of course, the growl sounds, the flutter tongue. One of the sounds he uses that I find interesting is the Spanish R that he puts on the front of certain notes. Right, just a little bit of a flutter right on the front of the note to give it a little extra something. And then he makes use of multiphonics, singing while you're playing. And he's really just all over the instrument. We hear double time lines in there. I'm not even going to attempt to demonstrate his range because my range ends somewhere around here, and I'll show you on the piano. Right, that's up around F5. He ends Warming Up with this fall off of a note. Way up there, like a full octave above where my normal range is. So he's all over the instrument. And those two tunes give you a pretty good idea of what he's all about. I would like to play just one more recording for you though, and then we'll get more into his pedagogy. And the recording I want to play is his recording of the tune Charity. And there's a specific reason I want to play this. It gives you a good idea of the lyricism he's capable of. It gives you a good idea of the virtuosity that he's capable of. But more importantly, it gives you a good idea of the broad musical appeal that he has. As I said earlier, I was a euphonium player when I started listening to him. I wasn't listening to him as a trombonist. I just listened because the music was good. And a couple years ago, I posed a question on social media. I asked specifically all of my non-trombone playing friends. I said, what's your favorite jazz trombone recording? And I got a couple different answers. One person said Bob Brookmeyer, and I thought, well, okay, but he's a valve trombonist. That's not really what I'm getting at. Who's your favorite what do you like in a trombone player if you're not a trombone player yourself, right? Because as a trombonist, I have a tendency to listen to how somebody plays the instrument. So what has a broader appeal? And one of the answers I got was this recording of Cherokee. And I'll play the opening, he takes a solo, and then there's an extended drum solo I'll skip through and listen to the ending as well. After an extended drum solo, and the band drops out, and he plays this. becomes, okay, how does he do that? And how can I do that? So, when I moved back home to Aiken, South Carolina, in 2008, after 9 years of music school, I had made the decision I was going to switch from the euphonium to the trombone because the euphonium wasn't really taking me any closer to playing the kind of music that I really wanted to play, which was improvised music, jazz, really anything with a rhythm section, rock and roll, R&B, funk, whatever it may be. But I had picked up the trombone and a light bulb went off. I went, I wonder if Wycliffe's still in the area and if he'd be willing to give me a lesson. Well, I kept my ears and eyes open for a little while, and sure enough, I saw he was playing in a club downtown Augusta one night. It was with the Wycliffe Gordon New Funk Revolution, so I went out to the gig, and interestingly enough, he played very little trombone on that gig. He played mostly keyboard. But I introduced myself on a set break, and told him I was interested in taking lessons, and asked if he'd be willing to give me a lesson. And he said, yeah, sure, do you have a business card? And me being fresh out of school, I did not have a business card, so I actually consider that my first lesson was this music is a business, go get a business card, right? But I did eventually take an actual trombone lesson from him. And to make a long story short, those lessons I had with Wycliffe Gordon changed my musical life. It changed my approach to playing the trombone. It changed my approach to improvisation. Within a year, I had a full-time trombone gig as a cruise ship musician. Not one of the most prestigious gigs in the world, but it is a gig that requires a lot of versatility, a lot of improvisation, and quite frankly, if it wasn't for the materials and the methodology that Wycliffe introduced me to, I probably would have gotten canned from that gig pretty quickly. And not only that, his teaching helped me survive the gig, but it also put me on a path towards a lifetime of artistic development that I've been putting in place for the last decade, and I intend to do so really for the rest of my life. Some of the things that stand out to me about his pedagogy and taking lessons with him is, number one, it's goal-oriented. One of the first things he asked me was, what is the goal? He said, if you can clarify your goal, then the path towards achieving that goal is going to become much more clear. So, goal-oriented approach to teaching. His teaching is very practical. He gave me things that I could immediately put into use and made me a better player. He had a unique ability to simplify many of the things that other people tend to make complex in my experience. And perhaps the most important thing is he emphasizes the importance of self-discovery. Right? He never tells you the answers. He never tells you exactly what he wants you to learn, but he points you in the right direction. He gives you the material, he gives you a way to approach it, and then he lets you make those discoveries. And as an educator, I know that's where real learning takes place. It's when you learn through the experience of figuring something out. And he has a real knack for pointing you in the direction to make those self-discoveries. Now, as I said, before lessons with Wycliffe, I had quite a bit of music school under my belt. I had gone to 3 separate universities. I had 2 music performance degrees. I had taken improvisation classes at each of those universities. Classes, lessons, played in combos, and for whatever reason, for me, all of that stuff I learned in school never really materialized into me being able to play any better. You know, I had all of this knowledge, but I still couldn't play a 12-bar blues. So to understand why Wycliffe's pedagogy is so important, let's take a quick look at what I learned in school, which basically boils down to chord scale theory. The chord scale approach to improvisation. All this means is it's the application of various scales to specific chords. And I think of it as kind of a color by numbers approach to improvisation. The way this typically works in a classroom, you hand out a lead sheet. The lead sheet has a melody. It has chord changes on there. You might listen to the recording of the tune once or twice, and then you begin to analyze what you see in front of you. You say, okay, on a major 7 chord, you can play a major scale, you can play maybe a Lydian mode or Lydian scale. Minor 7 chord, you can use the Dorian mode, and then you go through the whole tune and you prescribe a scale for each one of these chords. Now, there's a reason that that happens in the university setting. There's some positive aspects to it, and let me go over to the piano and I'll do a little demonstration for you.
chord scale approach, again, it's just prescribing scales. So let's say a C major 7 chord, you might tell your student to play, the simplest thing to play would be a C major scale, right? And then you go to the second note of that scale, play your chord D minor 7. And then you can play D Dorian mode over that. Now, why do we do that in a classroom setting? Well, for one thing, it's designed to get students playing right notes quickly. And I think a better way of saying it actually is it gets students playing or avoiding wrong notes. Because you take that D minor 7 chord and let's play D Dorian over that, all of those notes are going to work. None of those notes are going to sound bad. Right? I can sit on any one of those notes and it's going to work. It's not going to sound off. It's going to sound sort of right. But the problem is there's a lot of right notes that aren't necessarily in that scale. Another positive aspect of this chord scale approach is it gives teachers a rubric. And I think I can slip back over to the podium to say the rest of this.
But it gives us a rubric for grading. And for teachers and particularly for administrators, we always want to be able to give people grades. How else do we know if they're doing anything in class? So this chord scale approach, you just tell somebody to play a scale at a certain time, and they either do it or they don't. It's right or wrong, right? So it gives you this rubric for grading. Another thing it's useful for is if you have to say sight read some chord changes. If you're on a gig, somebody throws a tune at you you've never heard before, if you can apply your scales to that tune, then you can get through. You may not play anything necessarily that interesting, but you can get through it without too many clams. And it can be useful for analyzing what you hear. Say you do a transcription and you want to figure out what that person is playing. You can use your knowledge of theory to analyze what you're hearing. But there are some problems with this approach, being the primary approach to improvisation. And the number one problem is that it instantaneously removes the all-important oral aspect of improvisation from the equation. Right? If there's one thing that all great jazz musicians have, it's good ears. Simple as that. This chord scale approach tends to take improvisation and turn it into more of a mathematical coordination kind of exercise as opposed to an oral art form. Another problem that I have with it is that it de-emphasizes the importance of working directly with the source, the recorded music itself. Right? Students these days don't necessarily have a foundation in jazz music. 60 years ago, we were closer to the era of popular jazz. But now, students don't necessarily have that connection. And we need to be listening to the recordings. You can't play the music if you don't listen to the music. And then the other big problem I have with it is it becomes very complex very fast. And let me head back over to the piano and show you.
So using your C major 7, okay, major scale, or maybe Lydian mode would work. D minor 7, you could use your Dorian mode. But what do you do when you get to a dominant 7 chord? Well, the easiest answer, you play mixolydian. But then you learn that, oh, well, you could use, how about the bebop scale? Right, the bebop scale has this added half step in it. And if you want to use that scale, you've got to follow a whole list of rules to make it work out right. Well, you can also use diminished. Right? You could use whole tone. You can use every hip jazz musician's favorite scale, super locrian. It's so hip that we had to give it 3 different names. It's called super locrian, fully altered, diminished whole tone. We can't even decide what to call it. It's so complicated. Right? So all of this complexity adds up very fast. I mean, you get thrown these complex scales probably in your second semester of studying improvisation, if not sooner. And the fact of the matter is that's just too much to think about. And let me get back to the podium.
To quote Sonny Rollins, you can't think and play at the same time, right? He says, I've tried it, the music happens too fast, you just can't think about all this stuff and play at the same time. I mean, that 5/7 chord might last for all of 1 second. If you're playing a medium fast tune and that 5/7 chord lasts for 2 beats, you have 1 second to figure out which one of those scales you're going to play. And if you're trying to use this chord scale approach, you're probably going to try to play all the notes in that scale. Wouldn't it be easier to just say, what actually sounds right? What do I hear there? What sounds good? What does my ear tell me to play there? So how is Wycliffe's teaching different, and how did he change my approach? Well, first of all, he told me to start with a goal. He said, what is the goal? And I've thought about this a lot over the years. I've applied it to various areas of my life, but in terms of improvisation, the goal to me is this. I want to speak or sing the language of jazz through my instrument. And I also want to be able to express and develop my own artistic voice. So for me, that's the goal. How does Wycliffe recommend we get there? He gave me basically things to work on in 3 different areas. He gave me some technique exercises. He gave me a list of transcriptions to learn, and we'll talk about a little bit of the transcription process. And he gave me a list of tunes to learn. So 3 things. Simplified it for me, and he said, apply this concept to all 3 of those areas. Sing it first. He says the instrument is an extension of your voice. If you can sing it, you can play it. If you can sing it, that means you can hear it, that means you've internalized it, and if you've internalized it, then you can work to get it out of your instrument. The instrument is just an extension of your voice. And he actually has a book out called Sing It First. Which I have here. This is edited by Alan Raff, compiled and edited by Alan Raff. It's not really an improvisation book, but it does give you some insight into this whole Sing It First philosophy. So you might be interested in checking that out. But he says, whatever you're working on, apply this Sing It First concept, whether it's your technique, working on transcriptions, working on tunes, or even improvising. So let's look at more specifically some of the things he gave me. In terms of technique, I think that's pretty straightforward. To quote the great J.J. Johnson, who once said to David Baker, any idea that you can't get out of the other end of your horn is of absolutely no value in this music. Right? If you don't have the technique to play your ideas, the ideas aren't really doing you any good. So first you have to be able to play the trombone. And he gave me some things to work on, flexibility exercises, range, and then some more trombone-specific things, slide speed, doodle tonguing, that sort of technique work. But basically, you have to be able to play the trombone first and foremost. The second area he gave me to work on was in terms of transcriptions. He gave me a list of transcriptions to learn. I went in and played for him one time and did some improvising. And I did the stuff I had learned in school, right? I kind of noodled through the changes, played my scales, and then he said, man, you need some language. How do we learn a language? Well, think about how a child learns a language. They imitate what they hear. They listen, they imitate. At first they just make sounds, and those sounds become words, and those words become phrases and sentences and paragraphs. And then you start studying grammar and refining all of that. But it starts with imitation. And it's the same thing with learning the language of jazz. We hear that all the time. Jazz is a language. Well, we kind of skip the first step often in school. You got to start by imitating. So with Wycliffe, he recommends this process of oral transcription. And he differentiates between oral transcription and brain transcription. That's his term. Brain transcription is what we tend to do in school. And I had to do some transcribing in school, and what typically happened was a teacher said, go transcribe this solo. So I'd go home, I'd listen to it a couple of times, and as soon as I could recognize the rhythms and pitches, I'd start writing them down. And then I'd bring in my notation to the classroom, and we look at it, we analyze it, we talk about it, maybe we play it off the page. And Wycliffe says, okay, there's some value in doing that. But what I recommend doing, or what he recommends doing, is oral transcription. First, listen to the recording, then sing it. Internalize what you're hearing by singing it. He says you want to be like an impersonator. You want to become that musician that you're listening to. If you're working on a J.J. Johnson solo, you want to match every nuance of his slide inflection, his articulation, his phrasing. You want to match every nuance of what he does. And the best way to do that, the quickest way to do it, is by singing it, internalizing that sound, and then once you've internalized that sound, then work to get it out of your instrument. And that's actually going to save you a lot of time on the instrument as well, a lot of face time. And just to emphasize the importance of this language, another phrase we hear in jazz ed quite a bit is imitation, assimilation, innovation. Here I've got it quoted from Walter Bishop. Clark Terry is well known for saying this quite often. This is how it works. We imitate, and then we take the things we imitate and we start working them into our playing, and then eventually that leads to our own musical voice. That's something that we all seem to know, but when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of doing the work in the classroom setting, we tend to throw it out the window and just start talking about theory instead of actually doing the work of imitating. And just to emphasize the limits of musical notation, I'd like to play a Wycliffe Gordon plunger solo for you. If you think about the way we tend to notate the plunger, let's say in a big band, we use plus signs and circles, right? And let me demonstrate a little bit of this. So plus sign means closed plunger, like that. Circle means open plunger, and in notation for a big band you might see closed open or open closed, which gives you either like a wah or an ow sound. Well, that's all well and good, but that's a very limited understanding of the plunger. There's a whole lot of nuance available to the plunger mute, and I think this next recording that I'm going to play for you will make that very clear. This is Wycliffe Gordon playing a solo on a tune called The Intimacy of the Blues. It's off the album The Intimate Ellington. You know what album it's off of now. You can check it out on your own if you like. But let me just tell you, no amount of X's and O's on the page is going to really represent what you just heard. If we take, for example, just the very first phrase that he plays. Now, how are you going to notate that? If you're a trained musician, kind of a rhetorical question. You're not. If you try to notate it, and let's say you hand that notation to somebody and tell them to play it, it's going to come out sounding something like this. Right? And that's not at all what is on the recording. What he plays is something closer to. Right, and all of that nuance is done with the slide, it's done with the air, it's done with how you manipulate your mouth. There's a lot going on just in that one little line, and notation is just not capable of really capturing those sounds. It's a poor representation of sound. And I play that just to emphasize the importance of this oral transcription process over the written or brain transcription. Now, we learn the language of jazz by studying the recordings, by imitating it, assimilating it into our playing. The other thing we need is some sort of repertoire, right? We need some tunes to play. And Wycliffe, of course, gave me a list of tunes. I had taken improv classes, so I was kind of familiar with a number of different tunes. But the list that Wycliffe gave me really simplified all this information and categorized it and presented it in a way that all of a sudden things started making sense to me. He divided the list into these categories that you see: standards, blues, ballads, and rhythm changes. And gave me about 23, 24 tunes, something like that. Within the standards, he gave me all the things you are, and then he gave me a couple other standards, as well as their bebop contrafacts. So then I made that connection. I started to see the common forms that were used in jazz. I started to see where some of the bebop forms came from. The blues. Now, ask most people what the blues is, and most of them are going to tell you it's a 12-bar dominant blues. There's a lot of different versions of the blues out there. And his list introduced me to minor blues, bird blues. And so you start to pick up all these little things, and really every one of the tunes he gave me, as I worked on them, I started to discover they had a specific purpose. There was a lesson to be learned within those tunes. But he presented it in a way that made it quite simple to understand, and let me figure out those answers on my own. Now, how do you learn a tune? Well, if you were taking an improv class, you'd look at a lead sheet, you'd talk about your scales, and then the teacher would probably say, okay, now improvise. Wycliffe says, you guessed it, sing it first, right? Start by singing. And I'll give you a little demonstration here at the piano.
So how do you learn a tune? Start by singing. And quite frankly, in improv classes, this is a step that just tends to get skipped over. We immediately start talking about theory before we've even bothered to learn the tune, to learn the sound of the tune. But he says, start with the melody, sing the melody. One of the first tunes he introduced me to was All the Things You Are. Sing the melody. Well, guess what? That tune has lyrics. You are the promised kiss of springtime that makes the lonely winter seem long. And you can record it at the piano, listen to it, sing along with the recording, go back and forth until you've memorized, until you've internalized and you've learned that melody. Then you do the same thing with the roots of the chords. By now you're starting to recognize there's a structure to the tune. You're starting to pick out the form. And then you can learn the harmony, arpeggiate the chords. foundation that you're going to improvise over. And this is an important first step. But internalize it by listening to it, and then, finally, improvise. Use your voice, record the changes, and scat a solo over those changes. What does your ear naturally hear? You know, what sounds does your ear naturally gravitate to?
Now, this was a game changer for me, and I basically apply this to any tune I learn at this point. But by repeating this process with new tunes, more complicated tunes over and over again, you're shrinking that gap between what you hear and what you can play. That was huge for me, game changer. Repeat this process and remember that goal to speak or sing the language of jazz. You're getting closer every time you do this. Now, once you've exhausted all of your ideas, then he says, all right, now go deeper. Go back to the recordings of that tune. If you're talking about a standard jazz tune, that tune has probably been recorded dozens of times. It has a history, right? This improvisation stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just make up whatever your heart desires. There's a history to this tune. So he says, go to those recordings. Learn as many versions of the tune as you can. How do other trombone players play it? How does Frank Rosalino play All the Things You Are? How does Curtis Fuller play it? How do singers interpret the tune? What is the tune all about? What's the feel of the tune? We think back to Cherokee. I remember him telling me one time, Cherokee is a slow tune. He said, they're all slow tunes. People just play them fast. And that's really true. Most of these standards, they're slow songs. You know, so get back to what the song actually is. And when you go through this process, all of a sudden, you're empowered to make choices. Now you can say, okay, I like what Frank did here. I like what Curtis Fuller did here. I don't like what this guy did. I don't like what that person did. I like my own ideas here. And then you can make those choices. How do I want to play the tune? And that's where this whole innovation thing comes into play. And I'm going to play All the Things You Are here in just a moment. But I want to leave you with a quick story that I recently heard from David Gibson. David Gibson's one of the leading trombone players in New York City. One of his mentors was Slide Hampton. And David was relaying a story recently online. He said he was playing a gig with Slide one time, and on a set break, the two started trading choruses. One would play a bass line, the other would improvise. They go back and forth. And at the end of this exchange, Slide turned to David and he said, David, you have your own language. And David said, well, I don't know about that because everything I just played, everything I know and I've learned, I learned from studying one of your solos. And Slide said, no, David, you've got your own language. And what Slide recognized was that, yeah, maybe David had copied a lot of Slide's licks and ideas, but he was making them his own at this point. He was using some of the same vocabulary, but he was speaking his own language and expressing his own way of playing that tune. And that's where this whole innovation thing comes into play. Imitation, assimilation, innovation. And then finally, I'll leave this up as I play All the Things You Are. But Wycliffe says he often gets classical guys coming to him, people like me who are classically trained, and they say, I can't improvise. And Wycliffe says, no, everybody improvises. You just have to unlock that door. And for me, the person who was able to unlock that door and put me on the right path was Wycliffe Gordon. We're going to play All the Things You Are, and I've learned it by going through this process. You know, the way I play it today is not the way I'll play it a month from now or a year from now. That's all going to be informed by my continued progress of going through this process that he's introduced me to. But hope you've enjoyed the presentation. We're going to close out here with All the Things You Are.